so pleased to welcome Dr. Jessica Hooten Wilson to the Rosary Hour podcast today. Dr. Hooten Wilson is a professor, author, and speaker, professor of humanities and classical education, very accomplished and prolific scholar of religion and literature. She's written a number of books, which we will touch on today. We're really excited to have this conversation and to share your wisdom, because you've obviously thought a lot about these ideas. And particularly in light of our interest in creating sort of a classroom of the soul. So we have some educators on the team, and we'll have some questions for you about that as well. So where to begin? In your introduction to learning the good life, you were suggesting that as humans and as Christians, we are invited to become more or less like Christ, which includes how we learn, how we study, read, think, and live.
Mm-hmm.
How and when did this idea begin to inform your study and your work life?
Well, reading as a spiritual practice has been growing in my consciousness over the last 10 years, probably. As a teacher, I was going into the classroom ready to teach the Odyssey, ready to teach Dante's Divine Comedy. And what I found is that most of my students just didn't know how to read. And I don't mean the mechanical art of reading. I'm talking about the understanding that reading has more than the literal words on the page. Even the literal words on the page was difficult for most students to understand. That's where you begin with reading. They had lost their enjoyment of reading. They had lost their purpose of reading. They had lost how to ask a question of a text. I mean, just most of that had been killed in them by whatever education they had come from. And so before I could even dive into the Divine Comedy, I had to go backwards and say, okay, this is how you pick up a book. You pick up a book and you're being invited into a world, and you get to enjoy the words. You get to taste them and feel them and read them out loud. You get to love this story. You're going to have to read it multiple times to even enjoy it the first time. And then many times into the reading, then you're going to step back and you're going to think about it and ask questions and learn from it. And when taken that way, when recognizing that reading wasn't for you to extract what you wanted from it, it wasn't about producing something, it wasn't about networking, it wasn't about consumerism, it wasn't about the individual, it wasn't about self-improvement, it wasn't about knowledge puffing up, all these things that had cluttered their minds and kept them from enjoying reading. And when I started realizing that I was taking all those things out of the process, I began to see what I was doing was actually teaching them how to read as a Christian, to read as a person, to treat people and books, not as ends in of themselves, but things to be enjoyed and used, right? And used for the enjoyment of God, ultimately. And that was a huge switch for most of these students. And once they began to make that switch and seeing reading as a spiritual practice, they were loving the literature. They were experiencing a sense of freedom. They were being invited into a much bigger world than the one that they had inhabited. Again, to quote Chesterton, I don't know why he's on my mind this morning, but Chesterton says, how small of a cosmos you must inhabit when you're the only God, or something like that in Orthodoxy. So like you have this tiny, tiny cosmos because you're the God of that little world. But books break that cosmos down and they open it up. They smash it into millions of stars. And suddenly you can see more and you're free. And there is a bigger God than you in charge of things. And reading does that. So reading must be a spiritual practice if it took you to that place of humility, if it crashed your ego into millions of pieces. And then if it exploded your world and expanded your vision, it has to be a spiritual practice. Only God can do that. Only the Spirit can do that.
That's such a wonderful way of putting it. In preparing for this interview, a few things have popped into my head when I'm not even in front of the computer or anything. And one of those was just the way we all learn differently. And we learn, I think, as we get older, we realize this, that we learn by encountering ideas again and again in slightly different forms until they do explode into our consciousness. So I love the way you put that sometimes it takes a while, or it takes reading or seeing or appreciating some creative thing before we feel something, we experience something, and we know something new. I just want to move into again, we've been reading Learning the Good Life, which functions sort of as a textbook, right? It
Mhm.
introduces a lot of different writers, and I enjoyed revisiting and meeting some new authors in that book. Um, but one thing that stood out, and I know there were some things that stood out, a number of things that stood out for all of us, but Milton arguing that we must be permitted to read widely, and to know both good and evil, and in order to differentiate the extremes of virtue and sin. So I just wanted to kind of touch on that idea of what we should be reading as Christians, and whether should be any limits at all to that. And then also at one point he says, what a universal thing as books are. And it just really kind of underscored that books are in themselves kind of a community, in the same way that we have to function in a community in the world. In our faith community, we function maybe in this other community of books. And you have talked about how the act of reading is truly social. And I wondered if you could say a little more about that.
Yes. Okay. Those are two really good questions. So, one, what should be the content of Christian readers, especially if Milton is saying we're reading promiscuously? Is there any restraint on that? I think we have to understand that now some things are just going to glorify the ugly and glorify the filthy, and we don't want to clutter our imaginations with filth and dirt. So there's quite a few things that I don't necessarily read. Now, when you're reading, you can be more discerning than if you're watching filth. Uh, so, watching certain movies is definitely off limits for me. There's a lot of things I just don't want the images in my head. Whereas reading, I'm still in control in quite a bit of that space to interpret images or language and be able to discern and guard against that more easily than I can with films. So there's more. I feel like it's a more open playing field. If you look at something like Walker Percy's Lancelot, that's a very vulgar, gory book. There's lots of sexuality in it being discussed, and people called it pornographic. But what he's doing is he's testing the soul. It's kind of a litmus test. Do you still believe some things are evil? Then why do you permit them? Why do we excuse some sins? And so the book has a larger purpose. It's not glorifying the ugly. I think that's what we always have to discern. Basil the Great writes, if you treat it with the litmus test of the Bible, if you use the Bible as your rubric on literature, does it uplift the same virtues as the Bible? And does the book, is it repulsed by the same vices as the Bible? So the Bible becomes this great lens, but that means you, of course, have to be having an imagination that is biblical, that is founded in the word, that is produced by the church in order to read these other books. So it's not really a matter of content. It becomes then a matter of how you read these and how you interpret that. So that's one of the things I would say about what you're reading and how you're choosing those books. On the second part, do you read socially? Reading used to all be social. And if we take it even beyond the physical books you'd have in your hands, right? Genesis is only known to us because people passed down the stories to their children. So it was an oral, communal storytelling culture. And most of our great literature was produced in this oral, communal storytelling way, and now has become written, codified books. But we shouldn't lose that communal aspect of reading because of this new medium. And I think the medium sometimes convinces us, the medium of the actual, the physical book in our hand, it convinces us that this becomes a solo project between me and this book. But the reality is that there's an author even here. I need to be meditating and digesting her words. I need to be processing them aloud with another person. I need to be saying the words to give them life, right? Kind of like the vision in Ezekiel when you have all the dead bones, and then God says, speak, and his breath enters them and they rise up and have life again. I think of books that way, that books we're in process with. We're letting them rise up and become embodied by the way that we read them and then live them out. And I think we need to see reading as more of that communal social interaction between us and a book, and between us and a book and other people in their books, rather than going back to this solo endeavor about reading that I don't think is helpful.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I really what you're saying, I think, is really resonating with our group, because as Tina first spoke, our love is of literature and the humanities and theater and communication, and certainly there's nothing I love more too than picking up a great book and a beautiful glass of wine, as you first articulated on your day off. Certainly, that's something that brings me great joy too, and just the joy. Of holding even a book, the paper, the tactile interaction you have of engaging with a book. And I'm so curious in your capacity as an educator of young people, and as an educator myself, as we all are. Um, we are now in a world where young people picking up books is becoming less and less a reality, sadly. And the interaction of the device,
Mhm.
the cell phone, the screen. And I was writing down as you were speaking what you talked about, that relationship with the words in
Mhm.
a book, versus imagery, say on a
Mhm.
screen. It's a different way in which we engage our mind, our spirit, our bodies, all of it. Um, how is it that we, I don't know, cultivate that relationship
Mhm.
again with young people and sort of the art, if you will, of reading and
Mhm.
picking up that book when the stronghold, the chokehold, I would say, on young
Mhm.
people of the screen can be so handicapping, right?
Yes.
In so
Yes.
many ways. I mean, I'm curious. I would love to, hear some of your perspective on that.
Yeah, in one sense, I'm a total weirdo, and I'm maybe not even as weird as I want to be. We didn't buy a screen into our house until 2020, actually, when the quarantine happened
Wow.
and we were home so much. So we bought a screen, and I remember buying it at Best Buy. It was the fall of 2020, so there was like a little break in the chaos where you got to go back outside again. And my kids were jumping up and down in Best Buy about buying a screen. And the guy was like, "Are you guys Amish? Like, why do you not have a screen in your house?" And it was the first time we'd ever even allowed it in. And it's upstairs, and we turn it on Friday nights. And we have Friday night movie nights. And we have occasionally Saturday cartoons, kind of the old stuff. But we just don't do screens. We don't do screens in their school. I started their school. I was one of the founders of the school in our town for classical education, and doesn't do screens. I don't do screens in my classroom. I never had laptops in my classroom. People just sat there with books and talked. In our life, we just don't make it the default. It's not something that we're going to even be around. Even in dentist chairs, I we changed dentists because my kid's dentist would put a screen on and put the earphones on, and they're like, "Well, we find that it calms them and keeps them focused and makes them hate the dentist less." And I'm like, "Yeah, but you're also disabling my child from having their own internal coping mechanisms when things are uncomfortable or inconvenient for them. I don't want my kid to not be able to cope when life happens." So I think screens are becoming the default mode. If you're stuck in a customs line trying to get back into America, give the kid a screen so that they're not bored. If the road trip is too long, keep the screen on the entire time. Let them play video games and let them. And kids just are losing so much of who they are by that becoming the default. I'm not a Luddite. I do use phones. We do watch movies. It's just not the go-to. And I think that's the change I think people can make right off the bat is they can start making it the go-to needs to be a book. The go-to needs to be the book in the purse, needs to be the conversation with the person around them. The go-to needs to be silence when you're washing dishes and enjoying conversation with your husband or looking around at your children. The go-to needs to be going on a walk with your dog and not having to turn on a podcast. I mean, the go-to needs to be away from the screens and more towards people and stories.
Absolutely. There's some very good argument for that. And it does seem like it's a different brain setting, right? That we're losing our attention span. to spend time thinking. So
Yeah.
this brings us
Yeah.
to contemplation and the importance of contemplation
Mm.
and imagination, and that we're not maybe giving ourselves space for that. That we were made to be contemplative and to express ourselves through the gifts of the humanities, through the gifts of learning, and to gather and interpret wisdom. Um, so I'm just wondering, how reading helps us cultivate this contemplative and imaginative frame of mind. So we've entered into that conversation a little bit already. And then, beyond that, even the leap of faith that has to happen to move into imagination, and to how there's maybe some relationship between doing that in the way that we appreciate literature and the arts, and doing that in our faith. Sometimes our faith requires imagination, a leap of faith.
Well, I think everything requires imagination. So, imagination is the first go to. It's how we access things before we even get to the intellect, before we get to the will. We don't act except that we imagine certain things to be true, and we act within that imagination, if that makes sense. So, um, if I imagine that you are human beings, right? Versus if I imagine you are useful to me and I can get something from you, right? I imagine you are someone that I'm going to love and know that God placed before me, that you are witnesses to his creation, that you are stewards of love. There's all these ways of imagining your interactions with people, and you act on that. So everything has to do with imagination all the time. We don't really highlight that part of our lives. We highlight a lot thinking correctly, how we use our intellect. But the intellect doesn't even have anything to process or analyze until you first see things and first imagine things. So C.S. Lewis says imagination is the organ of meaning, and intellect is the organ of truth. So you first have to have the meaning, and then you analyze the truth of that meaning or not. So that's probably a longer conversation. But especially cultivating that, how reading does that versus some other mediums. There are a lot of other ways of cultivating healthy imaginations. A lot of art can do this. Usually it's things that ask more of you rather than you're taking from them. Reading is the one that I know the best. When you are reading a book, you are ceasing your talking for a very short time and listening. Listening in Hebrew is the same word as obedience, right? So you're actually practicing obedience by practicing listening. And when you're reading, you then enter into somebody else's way of seeing the world. So you're practicing expanding your vision, you're practicing empathy, you're practicing humility to listen and see according to someone else. You are cultivating what Jesus constantly said, why do they have eyes and not see, and ears and do not hear? You're cultivating an imagination that can both see and hear things that have been lost to the world, have been either silenced or cluttered away from being able to see and hear correctly, or see and hear with the eyes of faith. So I think reading does that. I think reading gets us into that space that removes all of the obstacles and distractions that are part of our daily life, and gives space for the bigger questions of what we love and who we know.
There's just
That makes
so
sense.
much to get into here.
Yeah.
Your next book gives us maybe a little bit more of the how. So we've talked a bit about the what to read and why to read is a big one.
Yeah.
But how to read as a spiritual practice, how to navigate perhaps that, perceived conflict between faith and reason in the pursuit of truth, how to approach and understand the wisdom. If once we stop our own thinking and listen a little to what others have to say, and others that have come before, and how to integrate that with our own experience.
So reading for the love of God, I very much enjoy my own title. Does that sound, I hope that doesn't sound prideful. I feel like it was epiphanic when the title came to me, but reading for the love of God, that for can mean so many things. You're reading for, right, the purpose of loving God. You're reading in practice for loving God, right? For the love of God, read. I mean, there's just so many ways that that title can come off, and I love that. And it actually strikes what I'm trying to do with reading is say that there's multiple ways to read. And so reading for the love of God goes through those multiple ways. It goes through how does this become a spiritual practice rather than a selfish practice in our lives, rather than just entertainment or only education. How can reading instead be something that moves us towards contemplation?
I'm curious, Jessica. I love you've been playful with that title, right? And the play on words, which is wonderful. The harkening back to something you said previously, we read as a tool for listening to others and their thoughts and their perspectives, and I very much am a proponent of we listen to understand. We listen to understand others. We listen to understand the world. We listen to understand God and his wisdom. And so the idea between, listening with our heart and mind to understand rather than with judgment or rather than with our own thoughts and opinions at the forefront as that filter that we're looking through, but really to clutter ourselves to be able to listen fully, right? And to really engage more deeply. And I think I certainly took from your books really that power of how do we learn and that invitation into the words of all of these, literary greats and, being able to extract those morsels of wisdom with a means of, deepening and respecting our, appreciation. So I think that's such a powerful message in your book, something that I found really resonated a lot. And I wonder if you can speak a little bit to the idea of how do we, this art of listening and the truthfulness in words and messages, and how do we sort of decipher and dissect that truth as we interpret what we read as a means of appreciating.
Yes. So you were talking about listen to understand. And I love the way that those words all play together because, as I mentioned, listen also means obey, right? In the Hebrew word. And to understand is to stand under. So literally, to listen to understand is to stand under another authority. I mean, you are standing underneath something. And so you're already practicing this position of humility beneath the author, which is the authority. And when I think it's Augustine that was talking about in the Confessions, the sense of standing under to let the text read you. It would have been De Doctrina Christiana. That's actually where it is. To stand under a text is to let the text read you rather than to read it. If we stand over a text and read it, we're pulling only what we want from it, and we won't actually transform because we're trying with our limited vision to get what we think is wisdom, which means it's not higher than us, it's beneath us because we can locate it. If a text is reading us, it's the wisdom, it's the authority, it's showing us where we have not been wise. It's showing us the truth that does not look like our current lives. And we're learning from it because of all the ways we're not like it. There's this position of humility that recognizes we have so much more to learn. So real wisdom happens by recognizing our place beneath rather than our place above the text. And that wisdom transforms and reshapes us. It's kind of, when people talk about literature shaping you, I always have this image in my mind of someone taking a piece of wood and carving it. I mentioned this in the Scandal of Holiness because Ernest Gaines, in his book, A Lesson Before Dying, talks about this old man who whittles wood and puts it into the shape he wants it. When you transfer that image into how literature shapes you, It's so uncomfortable, right? The idea that you'd have to shave off what doesn't fit that image, that you'd have to burn away things, cut away things. The shaping that can happen by literature should be a rather uncomfortable process. But that's what God's doing. He created us in an image that we fell away from. And as he's moving us and shaping us back into that image, it's going to hurt, right? T.S. Eliot talks redeemed by fire or by fire, right? It's the refining that happens or the damning that happens by fire. So you can actually be reshaped into God's image by him burning away all the dross, or you can choose not to be reshaped, and thus you're damning yourself by the fire. And it's not a purgatorial fire anymore. It's a damning fire, but the fire is going to happen either way. And I think literature gives us that practice session of being reshaped. It cuts away, it burns away, so that we can be sanctified in that process if we in humility stand underneath it.